In my prior role as cloud migration lead and solution architect, one of the things I realized is that as good as our company was at tracking assets for billing purposes, one of the things that fell short is really understanding the interdependencies between our software assets. And that led me to put together what started out as a prototype but evolved into an application that I'm going to show you today and talk about today that I call ITInsight. There are some questions that we have in the IT space that are very easy to answer, at least where we were. Questions that our hosting provider could provide, such as what servers comprise our infrastructure, because obviously we bought those servers, and what apps are deployed to those servers. We had an application catalog or an inventory of our applications that would tell us, again, what apps are deployed on what servers, redundantly to what the host provider told us. But it could also tell us who the owners of particular applications were and where the source code was, which repo it was stored in. Our application performance monitoring tool could tell us for a given period of time how many calls were made against a particular service and how long those calls took on average. And we have a service delivery portal that could give us the production endpoints for our apps in case we wanted to go out and verify that they're up and running. It also performed some synthetic monitoring to give a status of health for each app and service from each of our field offices that would result in a red, yellow, green status for each app and service. So those are some of the questions that are relatively easy to answer given what we had. But there are some questions that are not easy to answer. And these are from different perspectives. I'm not going to read through all these, but I'm going to highlight some of them that I think are important. As the owner of an application or a service, a couple of very fundamental pieces of information that's important to understand is what services does my application or my service rely upon downstream? What do I call and what do they call downstream from me? And on the other side, what systems are upstream from me that have a dependency on my particular service? Taking that to the next step, if we were to retire or rewrite or choose to rewrite or migrate from one application to another, what apps and services are impacted both upstream and downstream? And if I enhance, taking that one step further, if I enhance my app or service, what clients need to be tested? That's not an easy question to have today. And typically what we do is we test everything. But being able to understand what is impacted when you make a change would be hugely helpful. As a project manager or program manager or an architect, obviously understanding your inventory of all your assets, whether apps, services, integrations, servers, databases, all of that is important. And with different business verticals, being able to segment them by business vertical and say which of those assets are used by which vertical and get a perspective based upon that vertical. And in some cases, some of those assets are shared between those verticals. So understanding how they are shared is important, and which ones are shared is important as well, certainly from a testing perspective. And what integrations do we have with running services on the cloud? Third-party managed services that we may have integrations with. From a service delivery perspective, what databases are used by our app services? We have that inventory of what our databases are. We know what our apps and services are, but what are those interdependencies? And if any of those apps or services are in a bad state, a red or yellow state, what's impacted? What is the depth and extent of the impact of that? Or potential impact of that if it gets worse. I talked about understanding our inventory and understanding what applications are dependent upon each of our databases and third-party cloud services that we may have a dependency on. And then lastly, from a cloud migration standpoint, something that is more recent in my history that I was focusing on is looking at our inventory and understanding the affinities between them and the interdependencies between them, because that might help us identify which ones would be relatively easy or complicated to migrate to the cloud, given their interdependencies. And those same affinities might help us understand the waves of applications that can be moved to the cloud together. And then as we migrate, which ones are running in the cloud versus which ones are running on-prem. So those questions, given the tools that we have today, are not so easy to answer. And that was my hope in creating ITInsight. If we look historically at how the interdependencies were documented in the past, here are some pictures, and I know they're eye charts, but that's okay. You don't need to understand the details. But there are three different perspectives on essentially, or on many of the same data. You'll notice, let's see if I can get my cursor up here. There's an app in the center of this diagram called Leasing Source. Down here at the bottom, it's up here above, showing that Siebel integrates with Leasing Source. Up here, Leasing Source is here, and I think this is Siebel down here. That integration is depicted here. Over here is the BPM credit flow. Leasing Source appears here. Siebel appears here. And I'm sure if I dug, I'd see the BPM flow. There's BPM here, and the integration between Leasing Source and BPM. And I'm sure that there is a BPM integration. There it is, BPM integration between Siebel and BPM here. So if you look at these diagrams, you'll notice that they're varying depictions, and they look different between each author, right? They each have a different style. They each have their own centers of the universe based upon who the app owner is and what they own, right? There's duplicated effort, right? Because each team had to go about creating these diagrams. There's effort that goes into that. And they're static, obviously, because these are PowerPoint presentations or Visio diagrams. So they're static, and as a result of them being static, they get outdated very quickly. If anything changes, these get outdated. And as I pointed out, the data is redundant. We can show the same systems with the same integrations on multiple flows. Again, something that I want to address in creating ITInsight. I've got some diagrams in here. I'm going to save those. I'm going to go through the demo when I go through the demo, but I did want to come down here to the architecture just to give a little bit of background into how everything works. If you look at this diagram over here on the left, on the right, we're going to start on the right, is the database itself. And this is a module that is based upon a graph database called Neo4j. And I chose a graph database because I think they're hugely powerful, and it fits the data, right? The interdependencies between assets naturally fits a graph database, which consists of nodes and relationships between those nodes. In front of that database, there's another module, which is the API layer. And that module provides a REST API to pull data from the database, aggregate that data into a format that's needed by the client, which we'll talk about in a minute, and that's its purpose. That client, the ITInsight UI, is what any user will use to interface with the system, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. And that UI makes calls through the API. This is a single page application that makes RESTful calls back through the API to pull data from the database to refresh itself in its UI. So given that little bit of a background, I'll get into the demo.